Hi, I'm Tom Wadsworth. My doctoral dissertation focused on the nature of first century Christian assemblies and found that there's substantial differences between first century Christian assemblies and those that we have today. When my videos on YouTube started to explode about a year ago, I've been receiving hundreds of questions. Perhaps the most common question that I receive is about elders in these early churches or ecclesias. What was the role of these elders? What did they do? How did they function? This basic question has come to me many different times, and I wanted to have an entire video that focuses specifically on the role of elders in first century house assemblies. You might know that as a church, but I'm calling it a house assembly, which is pretty much the way early Christians met in the first century. But before we even get into this topic, I want to remind two things that were the basic findings of my doctoral dissertation in this topic. Number one, the idea of Christian worship services is foreign to New Testament Christianity. Now, that sounds bizarre to you. I encourage you to go back to my series of 7 videos found on YouTube that explore this idea in great detail. Indeed, the words for worship are never found in the New Testament to refer to what Christians did in their assemblies or certainly not to the purpose of what they did. These first century Christian assemblies are never called services, they're never called worship, and they're certainly never called worship services. Rather, they were focused on edifying the people who were there rather than on offering things for God. Another way to describe this particular anomaly is that going to a sacred building to make required offerings to God is actually a pagan idea. It's a Jewish idea indeed, but it is not, in fact, a Christian one in the New Testament. If anything, this idea of going to a sacred building to make required offerings to God is antithetical to first century Christian meetings. In other words, it's the antithesis, the opposite of what they were doing. Again, my videos explain this in a great deal more detail. But the second reminder I would have you recall as we begin this study on elders is that Christian assemblies that are repeatedly dominated by a pastor with a long sermon are counterproductive to Christian growth and development. We have explored this idea as well in several other videos on YouTube and in several of the articles that I have written and posted on my website. The idea here is that having one speaker dominate every assembly frustrates the apostolic directive to build up one another. 1 Corinthians 14:26 becomes a very important verse in dealing with this. This verse deals specifically with the Christian assembly. The entire chapter deals specifically with the Christian assembly. And 7 different times, Paul uses the word oikodome, which means to build up, means edification. He uses that in reference to what the goal of everything that is done in the assembly ought to be. So we need to remember that as we get rolling here on this topic. A key principle to remember is that when we're trying to figure out what's going on in the New Testament, what Christian churches were all about at that time, we need to start with the Bible and build a fresh understanding of what's going on there in the first century. It is a mistake to start with your doctrines and then try to defend them, because that process presumes that your doctrines are already thoroughly biblical. Rather, start with the Bible and then start to build afresh a new understanding of what's going on in the New Testament at that time and place. So our question here again is, what was the role of elders in first century house assemblies? And as we go to the Bible to build our understanding of the role of elders, I would begin with this verse, Acts 14 and verse 23. The context here is Paul is on his first missionary journey. He's endeavoring to go out and begin to proclaim the gospel to people who have never heard it before, and to start to make disciples. And as he goes through Central Asia Minor, now known as Turkey today, he begins to gain several disciples in several different cities. And then he decides to go back to these cities. And this verse appears in verse 23. When they had appointed elders for them in every assembly, having prayed with them with fasting, they entrusted them then to the Lord in whom they believed. Paul's pattern here, and it can be called a pattern, was to set up elders, plural, in every assembly or every church. By the way, the word church means assembly. I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But this is what's going on in the first century, appointing elders in every Christian assembly. Paul in Titus chapter 1 and verse 5 says basically the same thing. Here, this is much, much later in his ministry career. He's writing to Titus. He has left Titus in Crete on the island there, that he would set in order what remains there and appoint elders in every city, as I directed you, he says. And he goes on to explain the qualifications for these elders that he wants to set up in these assemblies throughout Crete. So it's not just in Acts where we see elders being established. It's also here in Titus where Paul reiterates this principle. If we look across the entirety of the first century world, you can find that there were Christian elders established in several locations. The first might be in Jerusalem. You see that round red circle around that E there. These represent probable locations where there were gatherings that were led by elders. I get these from the book of James. James in James chapter 1 mentions that he's writing to all the scattered Christians in the diaspora, which might be this very region represented by these E's here on your screen. And he tells them that he's writing to elders in chapter 5, verse 14, 15, 16, somewhere in there. Peter, also in 1 Peter chapter 1 and again in chapter 5, he mentions he's writing to the elders in these 5 locations, Pontus, Bithynia, Galatia, Cappadocia, and Asia. Throughout there, we also see elders. And in chapter 5, verse 1, he says specifically that he's addressing the elders there. That's not all, but these 3 locations that are mentioned in Acts chapter 14, where Paul says he's going back to these cities of Antioch of Pisidia and Iconium, and I think it's Lystra. There he establishes elders in every assembly. These are the ones we know about. There's also ones that we know about in Crete, where Paul told Titus to go and establish elders in every city on the island of Crete. We actually could have several different E's here throughout the entire island. And then, of course, also in Acts chapter 20, Paul mentions he calls to himself the elders of the church at Ephesus, and they meet with him there. So we know that there are elders at the Ephesian church also. So these are the places where we know from the New Testament there were elders leading churches or assemblies throughout the known world at that time. There may have been also elders at Rome or at Athens, at Philippi, Thessalonica, or Corinth. They are not specifically mentioned in these locations, but these E's you see on your map here are where we know there were elder-led assemblies there. So it begs the question, where did the idea of elder-led communities originate? I think it's been common for Christians to presume that, well, God ordained that there must be elders, and that's how that began. Well, actually, this idea, this cultural principle of having an elder-led community predates Christianity by hundreds and hundreds of years. Just look in your Old Testament, for example. There are elder-led communities mentioned throughout the Old Testament. Even Egypt had elders leading the country there. Look at Genesis chapter 50, verse 7. You'll see that. Israel and Judah, of course, had elders leading those areas as well. And plus a whole bunch of cities and regions like Moab, Midian, Gilead, Jabesh, Jezreel, Succoth, Gabal, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, even clans or large households or families of people that would have many generations and aunts and uncles would also have an elders in a clan. This is mentioned a few different times in the Old Testament. Elders of a congregation are mentioned. Even the priestly community had elders among themselves in the tribe of Levi. And elders of cities are mentioned very frequently throughout the Old Testament. So elders exist long before Christianity emerges in the first century. But it's not just there where these elder-led communities emerge. They are also found elsewhere, which I'll describe here in a minute. If you look at these verses where elders are described in the Old Testament, they were known for their wise counsel. They were known for discernment, for exacting justice in their communities. They were known for their wisdom. They represented the people of that community. They guarded the community. It is often mentioned in the Old Testament that there would be elders at the city gates. They are presumably acting as kind of like guardians to watch over who's coming in to this community and who's going out. They are having this guardian role and this governing role of what happens in their city. They also settled disputes, as is described explicitly in Deuteronomy 25. As a result of these roles that they had in Hebrew culture, elders were known to be esteemed, respected, honored, and favored. They were an elevated group in that community and in that culture, and had been for a very, very long time. Now, there's one verse that hit me is in Leviticus 19, verse 32, which says, "You shall stand up in the presence of the gray-headed and honor the elders among you." I had, by the way, this image you see. I went to ChatGPT, the common online AI program. They'll now create images for you. And I said, ChatGPT, can you create for me an image of a bunch of elders at the city gates of an ancient Israelite town? And this is what they generated for me. Notice there's one female in the group. I think as a general rule in the Old Testament, the elders seem to be mostly male. I don't think I recall any specific reference to there being a female elder, but they can get old too, and they can also become very wise and respected by other people and have gray hair as well. But this is the image that ChatGPT generated for me. One thing that I noticed as I looked at all these guys, it looks like they're all biological twins or something. They're remarkable how closely they look like one another. Again, this is just an AI image. It's not a photograph that was taken in 1000 BC or anything like that. It's just a projected image of what they might have looked like at that time. But the interesting fact about this is it's not just Hebrew culture that had elder councils running the city or running the community or running the clan, whatever it is. Greek city-states had elder councils. Sparta had its famous gerousia. The word gerousia is interesting. It's a Greek word. It's also found in our New Testament. It refers to an elder council. We get the word gerontology from this root of ger. We get the word geriatrics. The disease progeria, where somebody ages prematurely. All these come from that root of ger and the idea of gerousia. Greek city-states also had elder councils made up of older people who were revered and looked up to and had this governing kind of role. The Roman Republic is another good example for this. The Roman Senate, by the word Senate, comes from the Latin word senex, which means old man. Thus we have our words senior, like a senior citizen. We have words like senility, also referring to old age as well. But the Roman Republic also had the Senate and the senators who were commonly old folks who were esteemed for their wisdom. Germanic tribes, the German phrase Altermann means an old man. We get the word alderman from that. We have city councils that are set up in an aldermanic system around America and perhaps, I suspect, around the world as well. But it all comes from this idea that you have an older person who is on the elder council that rules the community. Arabic tribes, you've heard of the word sheikh, right? Well, the word sheikh in Arabic refers to, it means old man. And even in Arabic tribes, they revered and honored their older people, their sheiks, and they also had this governing role there. Celtic societies, Ireland, Scotland, Wales had them. Aboriginal Australian societies had their elders and their elder councils that were ruling. Native American tribes here in the United States and throughout Canada, whether you're thinking of the Cherokees and the Apaches and the Potawatomi and any kind of Indian tribe, they also highly revered their elders, and these elders also were respected for their wisdom and their discernment, and they would often make calls as to what the community is going to do in any given situation. Traditional African societies also had elder councils. Ancient Chinese villages also. This is just a common worldwide phenomenon of elder-led communities that is not just a Christian thing at all. It actually predates Christianity and goes back to many different cultures by hundreds and hundreds of years. Also notice that in Greco-Roman culture itself, they had things known as associations, like trade associations or professional associations, where these associations would meet on a regular basis, much like maybe like a civic club would in your community, wherever that might be. Philip Harland wrote a book in 2003 titled Associations, Synagogues, and Congregations, where he's studying the culture of these associations, synagogues, and congregations in the first century era. And he makes this statement: there are crossovers in titles with associations and with Christian congregations. And these titles are overseer, we get the word episkopos from that, or bishop, elders, the presbyteroi, servants or deacons, the diakonos, and the patronus, the prostatus. All these terms are also used in reference in the New Testament in reference to these various leadership functions within a Christian congregation. So again, my point here is that this idea of elder-led communities is very common. Having a council of respected elders was the common leadership structure in virtually all ancient cultures, and Christianity was no exception. So when Paul, there in Acts chapter 14, on his very first missionary journey, he establishes a gathering of Christians in one community, and then when he wants to get them organized, the first thing he does, he appoints elders in every Ekklesia, in every gathering where he has been and established Christians. This is just, it's not as though God spoke from out of a cloud and said, thou shalt set up elders in every, well, it's just the way they always did things in whatever community it was throughout the first century world, and again for hundreds of years prior to that as well. I did some more research, even looking up in Philo of Alexandria. Now, you got to understand what Philo is and who he was. He's a very interesting character, and anybody who endeavors to understand first century Christianity needs to become familiar with Philo. No, he's not a Christian. And no, he doesn't live in Jerusalem. He lives in Alexandria, which is really not that far away from where Jerusalem is. And he is a Jew. And he's living also at the same time that Jesus is living. Philo was probably born somewhere around 20 BC, and he doesn't die until about 50 AD. So when he's writing, and he wrote prolifically at that time, he's writing at the very same time that Jesus is alive and doing his ministry and teaching. He's writing at the same time that the early church is starting to grow and that Paul is doing his missionary journeys. So when he's writing in Alexandria, he's writing about the Jewish culture there. And if we want to know what the Jewish culture was in regard to elders, well, Philo has some very interesting things to say about Jewish elders. He says, "For he who is really an elder is looked upon as such, not with reference to his length of time, but to the praiseworthiness of his life." Interesting. How about this one? "Those who have spent a long life apart from all virtue, we must call them only long-lived children, having never been instructed in those branches of education which befit gray hairs," says Philo. "But the man who has been a lover of prudence and wisdom and faith in God, one may justly denominate that person to be an elder." So even then, in the Jewish culture, again, of Alexandria, Egypt, you see this emphasis on elders, but not just anybody can be an elder. You don't get to be an elder just by being old, but it's somebody who is a lover of prudence and wisdom and faith in God. If they've somebody who spent their life apart from all virtue, as Philo says, no. You're just a long-lived children. You're not a child. You're not an elder in the sense that we recognize them in our community. And I suspect this is true also in Greco-Roman communities as well. Not just any old person gets to be the elder of a city or a community. It needs to be somebody who has attained some stature of respect in that community. Ironically, this is the same thing you see in 1 Timothy 3 when Paul is describing the qualifications for being an elder. Or in Titus chapter 1, they needed to be respected by others, by the way they lived their life. We'll explain this a little bit more in a minute. So my point here is when first century assemblies appointed elders, they were merely using the time-tested way of organizing their community. As I mentioned, there's no place in the New Testament where God speaks from out of a cloud and says, "Thou shalt have elders." It's interesting also, by the way, there's no place in the Old Testament where God speaks from out of a cloud and says, "Thou shalt have elders in every community." No, they already pop up in Genesis as if they'd already existed. They're already an integral part of ancient culture, and this is the way the communities get organized at that time. So with that as background, let's go to my 4 key findings about elders in the New Testament. And hopefully I'm going to focus here on things that might be new to you and may have also the most interesting application when we start to compare today's Christian culture. Finding number 1 is that there was a plurality of elders in every assembly. We never see in the New Testament the existence of just one elder running one church. It's a plurality. Look at all these verses. In Acts chapter 11 or in chapter 21, there's a reference to the elders at Jerusalem. It's probably that James in James 5 is also referring to elders at Jerusalem as well. Elders plural. They don't talk about the elder at Jerusalem who's in charge. No. Elders. Elders in every assembly in Acts 14:23. Acts chapter 15, verse 6. This is the Jerusalem Council, as it's called. The apostles and the elders come together. Not just one guy, but a whole bunch of them assembling there. When Paul goes to Ephesus, he calls the elders there to him. Not just one person, calls the entire group of them. In 1 Timothy 4:14, Paul talks about the council of elders that laid their hands on Timothy. It's not just one person that does this. No, it's a whole group of people. The presbyteroi, or I think it's the presbyterion. It's a specific word used in the New Testament to refer to a council of elders. At Titus 1, we refer to this, appoint elders in every city, not just one, but a whole bunch of them. And James chapter 5, James says to call for the elders if anybody is sick and needs prayer. Not just one guy, but call for the elders. And then also 1 Peter 5 and verse 1, the Apostle Peter gets involved in this as well. And he says, I urge the elders among you. And he refers to himself as a fellow elder. We'll have more to say about that verse in a minute. Going back to that map I showed you a few minutes ago, remember that everywhere you look in this early first century culture, Christian culture, you see elder-led communities in all these different places. These are the ones we know about, and there may be indeed many more that are not specifically mentioned in our 27 books of the New Testament. So let's go to finding number 2, and that is that the word elder in the New Testament seems to be used synonymous with the word bishop or overseer, and synonymous with the word pastor or shepherd in the New Testament. When Paul called the Ephesian elders to him in verse 28 of Acts chapter 20, he says to them, the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. That's the Greek word episkopos. We get the word episcopal from it. To shepherd the assembly of God. It's interesting here in this one verse we have the 3 words, elders, bishops, and pastors, really, all used in the same context to refer to the same person or the same role. The elders were overseers, and their job was to shepherd the assembly of God. This is the same thing that was true, by the way, of elders over ancient Israel or elders in the Greek city-states or in ancient China or in Australia, wherever they are. These older people who rose up to the level of being on this elder council were indeed all overseers who shepherded that gathering. In 1 Peter 5, Peter himself says, I urge the elders among you as your fellow elder to shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. Again, the word shepherd is the Greek word poimen, which refers to a pastor or a shepherd. The terms are synonymous in the New Testament. And the word oversight there, episkopos, appears there again, as it did in Acts chapter 20. So it's just commonly understood that elders and shepherds and overseers, bishops, are all the same function. Not just, again, in the Christian community, but throughout the ancient world as well. So my point here is we tend to want to distinguish between, we have a bishop. No, that's somebody special, not just like an elder. We tend to, in many of our churches, I've seen different kinds of structures, but an elder board often serves something like a board of directors dealing with different kinds of functions than these early Christian elders did. Which brings me to finding number 3. If you wanted to know the kind of work that these elders did, they were doing work that applied to an assembly of Christians, a gathering. That's when these elders had the majority of their work. We sometimes think of elders, again, having their meeting on Tuesday night in the church office. Well, and that's fine. They got to do something. And they may be considering who to hire to mow the lawn next month, or whether we should replace the roof on the building. Well, I know somebody's got to do that, and I guess your elder organization is just fine for that. But in the New Testament, don't think it like that. Erase those concerns from your mind, because they don't have church buildings in the first century. They don't have lawn mowers. They typically don't even have a staff. And these are house gatherings for the most part. Small little gatherings of maybe 20 people, if that, maybe a few more, depending on the location. And this is where these elders work. And when they go to work, for the most part, it is in the gathering. When the Christians in that community come together in that home, that's when the elders begin their work. We tend to think otherwise, but that is what they are doing. They are overseeing, they are shepherding, and they are teaching. Remember that the word church, when you see it in the New Testament, most of the time it refers to an assembly. It is the Greek word ekklesia, which means an assembly of people. regardless of whether it is a Christian assembly or some other kind of assembly. It's just a word that refers to a gathering. So when we're talking about elders over a church, we're talking about elders over an assembly. Not that they didn't have eldering functions outside of the assembly, don't get that idea wrong, but the primary place where they were really useful in exercising their shepherding skills was in that gathering. And this is my point. The workplace of first century elders, Christian elders, focused on a gathering and not on a building. They provided shepherding for a congregation, not for a corporation, as they commonly do today. And I'm not condemning the way we've got it today, but I just want us to understand what's going on in the New Testament. If you're really interested in trying to figure out what's happening there and how we might gain some benefits from organizing our own gatherings, we need to understand what they were doing at that time. They're focused on the gathering, on a congregation, not on a building or a corporation. Now, finding number 4. These pastors, these elders, these bishops, overseers, and shepherds, they're all the same people, largely focused in on a teaching role. Not always, not all elders were teachers, but it seems clear from the New Testament evidence that teaching was a primary function of a good majority of them. For example, look at this verse, Titus chapter 1, verse 9. Again, Paul has sent Titus to Crete to establish elders in every city, and then he identifies the qualifications for these elders, and he says they must be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict it. Well, this is an incredibly important role in an assembly, exhortation and refutation. When people have false ideas or people need encouragement, the elders, the wiser, respected elders among a community would be those who would be primarily doing this teaching. Now, certainly there were teachers in the New Testament, that's the technical term applied to them, who may not have been elders, and there were elders who may not have been teachers, but for the most part, they are one and the same. Like this verse in 1 Timothy 5 kind of helps to set things in order here. Paul says, the elders, the presbyteroi, who lead well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at speaking and teaching. Now here, when he says especially those, he's kind of indicating that not all of them would have been known for their speaking and teaching skills. And yet, in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 2, when he's talking about the qualifications for the bishop, the overseer, he says he must be skillful in teaching. Again, you see this emphasis on teaching as a function of these pastor, elder, bishop people. And then one more verse to share here on this. Ephesians 4, verses 11 and 20. If you're a pastor, you've probably preached on this thing many times. Paul says he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for the building up of the body of Christ. It's interesting how this particular passage is crafted. There is a specific article before the word apostles there in verse 11. He gave some apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, some as pastors and teachers. There's not a some with the word teachers. It's like pastors, teachers is like a hyphenated word referring to the same function. Some are pastors and teachers, and their job is to equip the saints for the work of ministry for building up the body of Christ. And let me not leave this verse without noticing this building up reference here. That's the word edification. That's the word oikodome that we run into so frequently in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 when it's talking about the Christian assembly and appropriate behavior and activity therein. It is also to be done for the building up of the body of Christ, and the function of all these people was to build up the body of Christ as well. That's the focus of these elders. But you may be asking the question, well, where did our modern idea of pastor-led churches originate. If indeed, in the first century, all these churches, all these assemblies were led by a plurality of elders, where did this idea of having just one pastor or one bishop or whatever you want to call it, one preacher, to run the church or be in charge and be doing all the teaching, where did that begin? How did that start? Now, I've done some work on this. There are some others who have done a great deal of work on this, but let me try to share with you the best fruits of my own research on this. Throughout the first 3 centuries of Christian literature, it is noteworthy that the term pastor was rarely used as the term for Christian leaders. Now, where did I get that statement? Well, I didn't get that statement from anybody except from studying the first 3 centuries of Christian literature. One great thing about research today is you can get digital copies of all this literature and start to do searching of the word, for the word, like pastor or elder or bishop or presbyter or whatever these words are. You can search and find them all. And when I did my own search, it was shocking to me how rarely the word pastor is used in reference to these early Christian leaders. This is a later development that we are now the inheritance of. But one person, if you want to look to blame one person for where this idea of a sole leader running a church, who's the guy who's the culprit at the beginning of this, it's Ignatius. Ignatius of Antioch, a bishop at Antioch, no less, who got arrested somewhere around, 110 AD, maybe 105, somewhere there, very early. And he's being marched on his way, presumably to Rome, where he's going to be executed. And there's several places along this journey that he stops, and he drafts letters to Christian churches throughout the area. Well, he reveals his perception of church organization. And here's one of the statements that he makes in the letter to the Christians at Smyrna. He says, "Let no one do anything that has to do with the church without the bishop. Only that Eucharist, which is under the authority of the bishop or whoever he himself designates, is to be considered valid." Whoa! So now you can't even have the Lord's Supper unless you've got a bishop signing off on it. Interesting. Now, that's not all that Ignatius says. He has several statements. I'll just share a few with you. In his letter to Polycarp, he says, "Pay attention to the bishop in order that God may pay attention to you." Whoa! The bishop really has gained a great deal of power in Ignatius's mind and by Ignatius's time. He says in his letter to the Ephesians, "It is obvious, therefore, that we must regard the bishop as the Lord himself." Whoa! The power and prestige of these guys has skyrocketed already by the early 2nd century. And then one more statement. This doesn't come from Ignatius. This comes a few generations later, by the end, probably, of the 4th century, around 390. There, the bishop is viewed as the mediator between God and you. Now, forget Jesus. You don't need him as a mediator anymore, because the bishop is the mediator. And he is. This is a quote, by the way. This is a quote from Christian literature. He is, next after God, your earthly God. My heavens, how things had changed in a relatively short amount of time. But this focus on the one person who's running the show and has all the authority and power, as even to be viewed as God, the mediator between the people and God, whoa, things have changed a great deal. The thing that's somewhat surprising to me is you might think that, well, when Martin Luther came along in 1517 and hammered his 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg, he changed all that. Well, he largely really didn't change too much of the church governance structure. There was still just one guy, and he still called him a priest in many cases, the one pastor to run the church and have all the authority. And to this day, most of Protestant Christendom still retains that model of church governance, that views the one pastor as the guy who's in charge, who also does all the teaching, does all the preaching. He's the one person who is qualified to actually teach anybody. But all this thinking that's now flooded our modern mindset with regard to church governance is, I think, a violation of fundamental teachings by Jesus when he sat the disciples down in front of him. He said to them, "The rulers of the Gentiles domineer over them, but it shall not be this way among you. Whoever wants to become prominent among you shall be your servant, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve." And here he's talking directly to the 12 that he had been training. He trains for 3 years, and he knows that they're about to go out and become leaders of assemblies throughout the world. And he wants to impress upon them this principle of leadership. And yet how quickly it got forgotten as time went by. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. But what has happened today? So how did this happen? Why did Christianity so quickly devolve into this dominant bishop structure, this dominant pastor structure? Well, I think the problems of ego and sacralization was to blame in quickly distorting the role of these shepherding elders in the first century. Let me back up a second. It's interesting that Jesus, it's not going to let me back up. Anyway, my point here, Peter himself also refers to this domineering issue in 1 Peter 5. He's aware of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28 there, that we must not be domineering over those in our charge, but become servants. So the 4 key findings in the New Testament that I'm summarizing here now is, one, that there was a plurality of shepherding elders in charge of every congregation. The words elders, bishops, and pastors are basically all referring to different aspects of the same function in the early church. Thirdly, that the assembly place was their workplace. When the congregation gathered together and begin their assembly, where a lot of people are talking, that's when the elders go to work. They are also doing some talking, but they're also taking a role in watching what is said, making sure it's said kindly and gently and accurately. If somebody gets out of line, it would be the elder who would gently correct them and bring them back in to the fold of the proper line of thinking. And then fourthly, teaching was a key focus of elders in the first century. Now, if you're paying attention, you realize that I don't know really of any formal church today that mirrors this practice of what was going on in the first century. So you might ask the question, where do we go from here? And yeah, it's a real head scratcher here, because virtually every church that I'm familiar with that's got a church building has already developed for itself traditions and a culture and a model that really betrays this first century cultural situation. So where do we go from here? I offer 5 or 6 points here. I forget what I've got. First one, I think we need to appreciate the fact that there's really nothing gained by just simply changing the titles of the people you already have in these elder boards or these board of directors or whatever you call them. There's nothing gained by changing a title. There's nothing gained by automatically coming up, oh, we now have a plurality of elders who are on our board of directors. Well, great job, but nothing's really changed. We still have the same problems in our congregation, no matter what you call them. I could go on this, but let me just stop right there. I think in order to really get our heads around what's going on in the first century church culture, these assemblies, is we need to clear our mind of our church culture today. We can't be thinking in terms of this worship service culture, and this one-man pastor system with a pulpit where there's this dominant sermon thing that is the focus of our gatherings. Rather, as I mentioned at the beginning, the idea of Christian worship services is in fact foreign to New Testament Christianity. It was Paul who commanded in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26, let all things in the assembly be done for edification. There's a substantial difference between a worship model of a meeting and an edification model of a meeting. If you're gathered together to worship God, everything you're doing is going to be done for the worship of God. You're going to come out of that as really good worshipers. We know how to do that, don't we? But if you're going to a gathering where the stated and understood purpose is for everyone to be building up one another, I think we're going to produce a wholly different kind of people, and that the assembly itself is going to look substantially different, and that will affect the elders among them as well, because they will be firmly aware that this gathering is for building up the body of Christ. So those are the two things. Clear your mind of your church culture. But thirdly, I think this is the thing that hits me. And I'm more and more convinced of this as time goes by, that we need to acknowledge the weakness of oratory as a way to build disciples. There's a whole paper, whole new video on that particular topic to explore the idea. But I've really, even though I was trained in oratory, we called it homiletics in seminary. And every preacher who's hired by any church to be that guy in the pulpit, his job is to be this weekly orator, to deliver these magnificent sermons. And everybody sits there and says, wow, that sermon really missed the mark this week, or that was a great sermon, Pastor. But I found that as a general rule, people don't remember these great orations. Now, there might be a few you might remember. But generally, by the time you get into your car in the parking lot, you've already forgotten what the whole thing was about, even though the pastor may have railed on for 40 minutes on whatever his topic was. I think we need to recognize the weakness of oratory as a way to build disciples. And that is a fundamental problem that has resulted in, I think, our problem of not being able to find really good, wise teaching elders among us. I said this statement earlier on in this presentation. Having one speaker who dominates every assembly frustrates the apostolic directive of building up one another. The one anothering that takes place in the first century assemblies is such a dominant thing, comforting one another, encouraging one another, forgiving one another, confessing your sins to one another, praying for one another. The list goes on and on, speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. The one anothering that was taking place in these first century assemblies is something that doesn't take place in almost every assembly that I see in any kind of church of any kind of stripe today. But when we have one person who is paid to get up behind that big box we call a pulpit and rail away for 20, 30, 40 minutes, I think we're really missing out on allowing other people the opportunity to express themselves, to speak Christianly for the purpose of building up other people. Not every speech needs to be 40 minutes. It can be 2 minutes and still have several people participate in the gathering. Now, there's another thing that goes along with this. I think we need to think small groups. You may be wondering, well, I have a church of 800 people. How are we going to have a bunch of people speak in that? Well, you're probably not. But I think most pastors recognize that unless we drill people down into small groups, we're really not going to be building disciples. It happens in these small cell groups where people have the opportunity to ask questions, to express themselves, even to say stupid things so that other people can correct them. It's in these small groups where people grow. It's my experience that unless people are able and free to interact with whatever the topic is, of the sermon or whatever, of some scripture reading, whatever the topic is, unless they're able to start talking about it, they're not going to be able to grow and internalize the principles of what they're saying. Just to sit there in a pew and get yelled at for 40 minutes doesn't cut it if we're really trying to train disciples. That's my view. Number 5 of what do we do now, or where do we go from here? I think our gatherings, and think small groups, encourage small groups. These small group gatherings need to be built around the pursuit of one anothering and edification, of participation by as many people as possible, and the principle that everybody needs to be aware of, that we are here to build up one another by the things that we offer in our discussion with one another. So build the gathering around one anothering and edification. And then finally, to get back to our elder topic here, I think we need to rebuild a culture of wise, shepherding, teaching elders. And that's going to take time. It's largely lost. I'll tell you this story. When I first stumbled on these principles about worship in 1977, the first implication, or one of the first implications of this teaching, had to do with elders. In other words, when I realized that in the New Testament, they didn't gather for worship, they gathered to build up one another. The first implication from that I thought of was, whoa, maybe that's why I'm having such a hard time trying to find anyone in this church of 350 people who qualifies to be a wise, respected, older person. For generations now, even for centuries now, churches and churches and churches have had just one guy who is paid to do everything for us, and everybody else has never had the opportunity to develop their skills, to build their own Christian knowledge, to become a wise teaching elder in their Christian community, and thus we don't have any. That's a real problem. And one more story I want to close with. This also is about 20 years ago, I think. I was involved in a small group Bible study, and my son happened to be in that group. He was probably 25 years old at the time. And we were talking about the need to have wise elders who are respected and esteemed for their wisdom and discernment. As we were talking about that, my son spoke up and he says, I want that. He already knew that he wanted to, in his lifetime, to be that older, wiser person who was looked up to for having wise things to say, to being diplomatic in how they express themselves, to correcting others with gentleness. He said, I want that. I probably never could have been more proud of him than that one statement, but it's so powerful. I think that a lot of our young folks growing up today would like that as well, but we've left a culture where we have a council of elders over us. In some cases, older folks are just shipped off to a nursing home or to some senior citizen community, and we never see or hear from them again. I think that's a problem for our community. We no longer revere the wise elders among us, but we need to start recultivating that culture so that we can bring it back into the church, so that we actually do have wise shepherding elders among us. And as the clock is chiming on the wall, that's a reminder I need to wrap it up here. I appreciate your attention to this presentation about elders of the Ekklesia. If you'd like to see more of my videos on the topic of worship and the early Christian assemblies, I have one that's entitled Why They Didn't Preach Sermons in the Early Church. All these are on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/Tom Wadsworth. So thanks for listening. We'll see you again next time.